The year was 1933, when a young heiress named Barbara Hutton stepped into a lavish ballroom on her 21st birthday, and the world first whispered her name with awe. The lights above her sparkled like constellations, yet her eyes carried a distance that few in the room noticed, or perhaps dared to notice. It was a night of radiance, yet one shadowed by a loneliness too deep for diamonds to conceal. Welcome, dear listener. Tell me, when and where are you listening tonight? Share it in the comments so that we may weave a memory across time together. And if you wish, gently press the subscribe button so that this circle of stories may endure. Now, let us begin the tale. There was once a girl, small and fragile, who entered the world within the walls of great fortune. Barbara Hutton, born in 1912, was the daughter of Edna Woolworth and Franklin Laws Hutton. Through her mother, she inherited the golden legacy of the Woolworth Empire, a chain of stores that had turned pennies into palaces, a river of coins into towers of marble. The family was renowned not merely for its wealth, but for the aura of permanence that such wealth seemed to confer. Yet permanence is a word that deceives, for nothing in human life is ever so enduring as it appears. Barbara's early years, bathed in the glitter of privilege, were also shaped by a grief so deep that its echo would resound across her lifetime. Her mother, Edna, a woman caught between the pressures of high society and her own private despair, took her own life when Barbara was only 6 years old. This wound, invisible to the public eye, became the silent seed of all the sorrows to come. Imagine a house that is large enough to contain banquets, corridors long enough to host carriages within, and yet the child who lives inside wanders without comfort, searching for a voice that will never again call her name. Servants replace the mother's touch, and the girl learned to grow up under the gaze of nannies and governesses, each dutiful, but none able to offer the tenderness she yearned for. It is said that wealth can provide anything, yet what it cannot restore is the presence of a parent gone. How does a young heart make sense of absence when everything around her is gilded? One might imagine the silence of those long corridors, the way footsteps echo and return, reminding her that she is alone even when surrounded by people. Perhaps you can almost hear it, a cry of a child carried through a house too vast to soothe her. When Barbara was still young, her father too was a distant figure, more devoted to his own pursuits and the machinery of finance than to the fragile needs of his daughter. He did not vanish from her life, but he seemed unable to fill the emptiness left by her mother. The girl grew up in the care of relatives, especially under the watchful, if stern, presence of her grandmother, Jenny Woolworth. The old matriarch was formidable, a figure of both security and intimidation, holding firm to the traditions of respectability and social duty. But duty is not the same as affection. Children sense the difference. Barbara felt it in every glance, in every word spoken with firmness, but rarely with warmth. And so the child, though materially richer than nearly anyone in her generation, grew inwardly poorer in the most essential of ways. This paradox, wealth without love, comfort without comfort, followed her like a shadow. The newspapers would later call her the poor little rich girl, as if the phrase could capture the irony of her fate. Yet in those early years, no journalist's pen was needed to make her feel the poverty of spirit that attended her fortune. As she grew, Barbara was taught all the refinements expected of a young lady of her station. Tutors ensured she spoke languages, played music, and understood the manners of court and salon. Yet even as she learned these things, her heart remained unanchored. Children with broken beginnings often look outward with longing, and so it was with her. She gazed at others who seemed to possess the ordinary joys, mothers who embraced their children in public parks, families that laughed together in simpler homes, and she wondered if such ordinary happiness might be more valuable than pearls locked in boxes of velvet. In that contrast, In that tension between opulence and emptiness, the story of Barbara Hutton's life was already being written. Each lesson in posture, each carefully chosen gown, each orchestrated dinner was a reminder of her role. She was the heiress, the Woolworth treasure, the symbol of enduring wealth. But within, she was simply a girl, longing for affection, for assurance that she was more than her inheritance. Is it not strange, dear listener, how the human heart measures wealth differently from the world? We place value not on gold or estate, but on embraces, on kindness, on the presence of those who truly see us. When those things are absent, no palace is grand enough to disguise the emptiness. Barbara's early years were also marked by whispers. Whispers within her household, whispers among acquaintances, that she was to be protected, shielded, perhaps even guarded from the knowledge of her mother's death. Some said she was told for years that her mother had simply gone away, a gentler lie to shield a child from the truth. But children, with their uncanny senses, often perceive what is left unspoken. Perhaps Barbara knew, in some wordless way, that abandonment had already entered her life, even if the word itself was never uttered. The memory of that early loss remained, like a wound that never quite closed, and it is possible that every gesture of longing in her adult years can be traced back to those first nights when she lay awake in a room filled with fine furnishings, yet starved of a mother's whisper at the bedside. And so we see her, a child among riches. But riches cannot cradle the heart. She was raised to attend parties, to meet society, to wear the garments of wealth, but within she walked with shadows that no one else could see. Those shadows would follow her into youth, into marriage, into motherhood, and finally into decline. But at this early stage of the tale, we need only imagine the image of a small girl in a large, echoing house. The corridors are silent except for the muffled sounds of servants beyond doors, the rustling of gowns as women pass by without pausing, the click of shoes on marble. Somewhere outside, carriages clatter along the street, and voices murmur of fortunes being counted, stores being built, the empire of Woolworth spreading across the land. But inside, within the chambers of a little girl's heart, there is silence, broken only by the cry of one who misses her mother. It is in this image, more than in the records of banks or the columns of society pages, that Barbara Hutton's story truly begins. For every life has its defining absence, the hollow place that no abundance can fill. For her, that absence was there from the start, and it is here, at the beginning, that the echoes of her sorrow first became part of her legend, though the world would not recognize them until many years later. And so part one ends not with the clang of wealth, not with the flash of jewels, but with the faint sound of a child's cry fading in the vastness of a house too large to comfort her. The child's cry faded, and in its place there arose another sound. Decades later, the ringing of crystal glasses lifted high in celebration, echoing beneath the great chandeliers of the Waldorf Astoria. It was the evening of Barbara Hutton's 21st birthday, and the vast ballroom glittered with every element of spectacle that wealth could purchase. Diamonds sparkled not only on her gown, but in the eyes of the many who came, drawn as much by her fortune as by her youth. The orchestra played in swelling notes, laughter mingled with the clinking of silver, and the night carried the weight of legend in its making. For on this day she had become not merely a young woman, but an heiress of extraordinary measure, inheritor of a fortune so vast that newspapers devoted entire columns to the calculation of her wealth. The spectacle was carefully arranged, the room dressed in opulence as if it were a stage upon which Barbara must play the part written for her since birth. She wore jewels of breathtaking brilliance, the kind that seemed to hold stars within them, and a gown designed to whisper of elegance while declaring status. Around her gathered society's finest, men in tailored suits, women draped in silks, each face illuminated not merely by candlelight, but by expectation. They had come to witness and perhaps to claim a place in the orbit of her fortune. But behind the surface of it, if one could look past the glimmer of chandeliers, there was a young woman who stood as though slightly apart from her own celebration. Barbara's eyes, though gracious, often drifted into distances unseen, as though she listened to a different music than the orchestra offered. Guests saw her smile, yet did they notice the faint hesitation, the small pause before her laughter? Did they sense that the riches which dazzled them all weighed upon her like chains, unseen but heavy? For what is a fortune inherited without the compass of affection? What is a ballroom filled with admirers if the heart within feels itself a solitary witness? The grandeur of that night, the most extravagant debut that even a city accustomed to spectacles could recall, was at once her coronation and her confinement. It declared her the possessor of untold wealth, yet it marked her too as prey, for the fortune she carried would draw to her a lifetime of seekers, suitors, flatterers, and betrayers. The papers at the time marveled at the sums. Tens of millions, they said, though the precise figure mattered less than the symbolic weight. She was one of the richest women in the world, and yet also, as one columnist remarked, the loneliest girl in the room. How strange it must have felt to stand at the center of so much noise, so many eyes, and yet to feel the silence that lingers deep within the soul. Perhaps she herself wondered if the applause was for her, or for the fortune she represented. Around her, toasts were raised, their glass stems catching the light. Each toast rang like a promise, yet also like a demand. To wealth, to beauty, to youth, they proclaimed, and all the while the sound of crystal chiming grew louder, as if to drown out the subtler truth, that here was a young woman unready, unsteady, longing perhaps for something far simpler than riches. She had not asked for this inheritance, but it had claimed her, and in claiming her, it had set the path from which she could scarcely deviate. Is it not often so, dear listener, that the greatest gifts the world envies are the very burdens that crush the spirit of those who hold them? Inheritance can be a blessing, yes, but it is also a destiny written by others, a script that allows little space for the lines of one's own choosing. Barbara, at 21, was feted as queen of wealth, but she was also bound by it, as surely as any prisoner to her chains. The night unfolded with splendor. Dancers spun across the floor, the orchestra played until the small hours, and every guest departed with stories to tell of the jewels, the gowns, the sheer extravagance. Yet within Barbara herself, a quieter story stirred. She felt the attention of many young men who sought her glance, her smile, perhaps her favor. But in their eyes she often glimpsed the gleam not of love, but of calculation. Was it her hand they sought, or the fortune it carried? Was she admired, or merely measured? Such questions haunted her in the years that followed, for this was the paradox of her position. Love, that most elusive of treasures, seemed forever tangled with suspicion. Could she ever be certain of affection untainted by greed? Even on that night of her grand ball, as crystal rang and laughter swelled, the uncertainty was already whispering. And so the image of that evening remains fixed in memory, a young woman radiant in silks, her jewels flashing in the light, the music surrounding her in waves, the glasses raised in salute. But if one could step closer, if one could listen beneath the orchestra, one might hear the quiet dissonance of her heart, beating out of step with the rhythm imposed upon her. That night, which should have been the triumphant beginning of her adult life, was also the moment when the weight of her role settled fully upon her shoulders. She had wealth enough to buy anything, yet she could not purchase the certainty of being loved for herself. The title bestowed upon her in those years, the poor little rich girl, was born not merely of her fortune, but of the recognition, however dimly sensed, that money had not brought her happiness. The echoes of that ballroom lingered with her, shaping her path into adulthood. Each chime of glass, each cheer of the crowd was both a celebration and a warning. She would seek love. She would pursue companionship, but always against the backdrop of suspicion, always with the lingering doubt. Do they see me, or do they see only the fortune that surrounds me? As the evening drew to its close, the chandeliers dimmed, the orchestra softened, and the guests departed one by one. Barbara remained for a while, a solitary figure in the fading splendor. Perhaps she looked at the floor scattered with petals, the tables lined with half-empty glasses, the remnants of celebration already becoming memory. Perhaps in that moment she felt the curious stillness that follows noise, when the truth of solitude emerges most clearly. For all the wealth, for all the spectacle, she was alone with her thoughts, just as she had been in the echoing corridors of childhood. And so the transition from child to heiress was complete. But it was not a transition into joy. It was into another form of isolation, one clothed in finery, yet isolation nonetheless. The child's cry had become the faint chime of crystal, both sounds echoing with the same unanswered longing. As she left the ballroom that night, stepping into the cool air beyond the hotel doors, perhaps she paused. The streets outside did not glitter like the chandeliers within. They were filled with ordinary people, walking with companions, laughing quietly, holding hands without thought of fortune. Did she envy them? Did she wonder in that fleeting moment whether the smallest ordinary affection might outweigh the grandeur she carried? The answer we cannot know, for she spoke of it rarely, if ever. But the question lingers, as do all questions born from emptiness. And it is with that question that we follow her forward into the world of suitors and promises, of romances begun in hope and ended in betrayal. The long and winding search for the love that seemed always just beyond her reach. Yet before we enter those stories, let us hold for a moment the image of crystal glasses chiming in the ballroom, the sound bright and clear. But within it, if one listens closely, a faint echo of something unresolved, something that cannot be drowned even by the orchestra. It is the sound of longing, hidden within celebration, the beginning of a search that would shape the whole of her life. A hand reached across the table, tentative, uncertain, its movement carrying the suggestion of intimacy, of connection. Yet before fingers could meet, the hand withdrew, leaving only the faint rustle of fabric and the silence of words unsaid. This gesture, small and almost invisible, holds within it the essence of Barbara Hutton's early encounters with love. For in her youth, after the dazzling debut of her 21st birthday, she longed for companionship, for the tender certainty of a hand that would not retreat. And yet again and again she found herself caught between hope and hesitation, between the yearning of her heart and the suspicions born of her fortune. She was, by all outward appearances, the most eligible young woman of her generation. Wealth without limit, beauty touched with fragility, and a name that commanded attention wherever it was spoken. Young men sought her company with eagerness, drawn to the aura of her inheritance as much as to her presence. They crowded her evenings, wrote her letters, invited her to parties, always with polite words and elegant manners. Yet within each approach, she sensed something unsteady, a calculation behind the charm. Was it affection or ambition? Were their eyes warmed by tenderness, or merely lit by the gleam of gold reflected through her name? Barbara's own heart, however, longed for something real. She wanted not suitors who performed attentions, but a partner who would see her, who would look past the dazzling surface and glimpse the child who still wandered the long corridors of memory. It was in these years that she first began to test the boundaries of romance, to step cautiously toward those who offered gestures of affection, only to find that too often the hand reaching for hers would withdraw, or else grasp too tightly, crushing tenderness beneath the weight of greed. In quiet corners of restaurants, in gardens lit by lanterns, in carriages where conversation should have flowed, she sought intimacy, yet found distance. Those early relationships, barely more than tentative beginnings, were shadowed by suspicion. She would wonder, if I had been born without fortune, would this man still be seated across from me tonight? Would he still smile at my words, still speak of futures, still reach out his hand? The answer, uncertain and unspoken, cast a veil over each encounter. And so, her search for love, which for others might have been simple or joyful, became for her a delicate negotiation with doubt. Imagine the weight of such uncertainty. Every kind glance suspect, every promise potentially hollow, every embrace shadowed by the thought that it might be more a transaction than a gift. For those who inherit vast wealth, love is never free of suspicion. It is tested again and again, often to the point of breaking. In this time, Barbara grew restless. She attended gatherings, traveled, moved among the bright circles of high society, yet often left them feeling empty. The laughter of others, the dances and music, the promises exchanged between couples, these she witnessed as if through glass, close enough to see but distant enough to remind her of her own separation. She was admired, but not known. She was sought, but rarely understood. There were, of course, those who charmed her, handsome men with elegant manners, figures of worldly sophistication. She allowed herself to hope, to lean into the possibility that perhaps, this time, affection was genuine. But each time, the pattern seemed to repeat. Interest flared brightly at first, then cooled in a disillusionment, leaving her again with the ache of solitude. Is it not curious, dear listener, how the human heart continues to hope, even when hope has so often been betrayed? She could have closed herself entirely. She could have declared herself resigned to solitude, but she did not. Instead, she sought again and again, as though each disappointment only sharpened her hunger for the real. Perhaps it was because the absence from her childhood was so deep that she could not help but search, no matter the cost. And so the hand that reached across the table and withdrew becomes the emblem of these years. Gestures of love begun but never completed, promises half-formed, moments of intimacy dissolved before they could root themselves in truth. Barbara's longing was sincere, her heart open, but her circumstances placed her in a realm where sincerity was scarce, and where every step toward love seemed also a step toward betrayal. Her friends, or those who called themselves friends, often spoke of her beauty, of her generosity, of her grace. Yet they too were not immune to the temptation of her fortune. They gossiped, they speculated, they judged her choices with casual cruelty, as society so often does. Barbara, who wanted nothing more than loyalty, discovered instead that even companionship was fragile, easily broken when her wealth casts too large a shadow. And so her early romances left her unsatisfied, her heart bruised not by great scandals, but by the smaller, subtler pains of disillusionment. She walked away from dinners with an emptiness greater than when she had arrived. She watched the withdrawal of hands, the cooling of glances, the silence where words of devotion might have been. Each time the wound of her childhood seemed to reopen, reminding her of the absence that had shaped her from the beginning. But Barbara was not merely passive in this. She too withdrew at times, fearful of being deceived, cautious in her own gestures of affection. She had been taught to mistrust by experience, and so even when love might have been possible, she hesitated, uncertain whether to believe. Thus, the dance between her and her suitors was one of advance and retreat, of tentative steps forward, followed by cautious withdrawal. The very wealth that should have secured her life instead undermined her heart, placing doubt at the center of every possibility. If one were to pause here, in this moment of her story, one might reflect upon the irony of her fate. A young woman admired by all, endowed with means to command any luxury, yet struggling to find the simplest of gifts, a hand that would remain steady when reaching across the table. Wealth had drawn many toward her, but it had not brought her the only thing she truly sought. The evenings ended, the tables were cleared, the gardens emptied, and Barbara returned alone to her rooms, where jewels lay upon dressing tables and gowns hung in closets lined with cedar. Yet none of these things answered the question she carried. Could she ever be loved without condition? Could she ever find a companion who would reach for her hand and not withdraw? The silence of those rooms echoed with that question, a silence not unlike the vast corridors of her childhood. It was as if her life had come full circle, from a little girl crying for her mother's touch to a young woman longing for a lover's embrace. The ache remained the same, merely clothed in different forms. And though the world around her saw glamour, luxury, and privilege, within her there was still the same unanswered cry. The story now turns toward the moment when she believed she had found her answer, when a man appeared who carried the title of prince and seemed to promise both love and dignity. His name was Alexis Medivani, and he would become her first husband, the first to take her hand not just across a table, but at an altar. Yet even there, in the splendor of marriage, the pattern of disappointment awaited. But before we step into that union, let us remain for a moment with the image of the withdrawn hand, the rustle of fabric, the silence that followed. For it is in that gesture, more than in the public headlines, that we glimpse the truth of her heart, a heart reaching outward again and again, only to find the world reluctant or unworthy to meet it. Footsteps faded upon foreign soil, a sound soft yet fateful, for they marked the beginning of Barbara Hutton's first great journey into marriage. The year was 1933, not long after her dazzling ball, when she placed her hand in that of Prince Alexis Medivani, a man of title, charm, and worldly confidence. To the outside world, it seemed the perfect union, the richest young woman of America with a prince of Europe. Newspapers rejoiced at the glamour of it, their pages filled with photographs of her radiant smile, his aristocratic bearing, the promise of fairy tale romance. Yet as with many stories cloaked in brilliance, the truth beneath was more fragile, and the footsteps they took together led not toward happiness, but toward betrayal. Alexis Medivani came from a family of Georgian émigrés, noble by name, though less secure in fortune. He embodied the aura of a bygone world, where titles carried weight, even as the empires that sustained them had fallen. For Barbara, still so young and searching, the idea of marrying a prince must have seemed like the fulfillment of every dream whispered to her in childhood. Dreams of belonging, of being cherished, of stepping into a story that might finally redeem her loneliness. Did she not believe, perhaps with the innocence of hope, that love dressed in royal dignity would be safer, more lasting than the fleeting affections of suitors at her ball? Their courtship was swift, their wedding even swifter. The ceremony itself carried the splendor one would expect, jewels glittering, silks sweeping, cameras flashing. Friends and society figures gathered in admiration, whispering to one another that Barbara had truly arrived at destiny. She, too, may have believed it in those first days, carried along by the tide of romance, eager to believe that at last a hand had reached across the table and remained steady in its grasp. Yet marriage, as so many discover, is not sealed by ceremony alone. Behind the veils of glamour, reality soon began to show itself. Alexis, though prince by birth, was a man accustomed to the pleasures of wealth, and he looked to Barbara not only with affection, but with expectation. He enjoyed the luxuries her fortune provided, the travel, the estates, the endless stream of comforts. But affection that depends upon fortune is a fragile root, and soon she discovered that the soil of their marriage was shallow. Barbara, who had longed for loyalty and tenderness, found instead a partner often preoccupied with his own desires. Their relationship grew strained, punctuated by quarrels, misunderstandings, and the slow erosion of trust. Those who observed from the outside may have seen only the glamour, the photographs of them in Europe, the jewels, the carriages. But within the marriage itself, the emptiness Barbara had known since childhood reasserted itself. How strange it must have seemed to her to be called a princess and yet feel so little security, so little of the stability she had hoped for. The title, impressive as it sounded, was no shield against neglect. Was it not, perhaps, another chain, another illusion dressed in finery? The very thing she thought would save her from loneliness became instead another mirror reflecting her solitude. In those early months of marriage, Barbara began to sense a pattern that would mark her life again and again, the outward promise of love, dazzling in its presentation, slowly dissolving into disappointment. It was as though she were destined to repeat the wound of her childhood in every union she entered. She gave trust and in return found betrayal or indifference. She offered her heart and received in exchange only partial devotion, easily withdrawn. The story of Alexis Mandevani is not merely the tale of one man's failings. It is also the story of the hunger within Barbara herself, the hunger for love so great that it led her to seize upon symbols, to believe in the titles and appearances that promised security. She wanted so desperately to be loved for herself that she was willing, perhaps unconsciously, to believe in illusions, to trust in masks. Who among us has not at some point believed in something because we needed it to be true? Their travels across Europe were marked by extravagance. Photographers captured them in Paris, in London, in the Mediterranean sun. Yet for Barbara, the very journeys that should have brought joy became reminders of instability. Alexis, it was said, spent lavishly, indulged freely, and treated her fortune as though it were a river without end. To a world that knew only the figures written in financial columns, such wealth may have seemed inexhaustible. But to Barbara, each display of careless indulgence carried the sting of betrayal, not merely of money, but of trust. The quarrels grew louder, the distance between them wider. Soon it became clear that the marriage was faltering, and whispers of separation began to circulate in society's circles. For Barbara, it was another wound, a deepening of the sorrow she carried. She had entered into marriage with hope, believing that this time the hand would remain, that this time she would not be left alone. But once again she found herself abandoned, not in the literal sense of her mother's departure, but in the emotional withdrawal of a partner who had promised more than he delivered. When their union ended, it left Barbara scarred, but also restless. Divorce, especially in those years, carried its own burden of scandal, yet her wealth and notoriety ensured that the story was reported across the world. The newspapers, ever eager for contrast, reminded readers of her great fortune while describing the failure of her marriage. The title "Poor Little Rich Girl" was used again, sometimes with pity, sometimes with cruelty, and Barbara, though perhaps hardened by disappointment, could not escape the sting of seeing her private pain made into public entertainment. And yet, even in the ruins of this first marriage, Barbara did not cease to hope. This is perhaps the most haunting quality of her story, that no matter how often she was betrayed, she returned to the search for love. Some might call it folly, others resilience. Was it the curse of her fortune or the persistence of her longing? The answer lies, perhaps, in the shadows between the two. Her marriage to Alexis had promised dignity and delivered emptiness. But Barbara, ever restless, soon sought escape, not merely from him, but from the world that seemed always to betray her. She began to travel more widely, to move across continents as if searching for something the earth itself might reveal. The footsteps we hear now are no longer those of a couple, but of a solitary figure moving across foreign soil through cities and landscapes where she hoped, perhaps, to lose herself or to find herself anew. And so this chapter ends not with triumph, nor even with quiet resolution, but with the sound of footsteps fading, a woman walking away from the illusion of marriage, her fortune intact, but her heart more bruised than before. Behind her lay the shattered promise of royal love. Before her lay the uncertain path of further journeys. The soil upon which she walked carried the marks of countless others, yet for her it seemed always foreign, never quite home. The footsteps faded into silence, and in their place came the long, low cry of a train whistle in the night, echoing across valleys and fields, carrying with it both promise and sorrow. For Barbara Hutton, restless and wounded by her first marriage, travel became not merely movement across geography, but an escape, a search, a wandering meant to fill the hollowness within. She boarded trains that cut across continents, ships that moved through oceans, automobiles that carried her along winding coastal roads. Each journey offered a momentary illusion of freedom, yet wherever she went, the ache of loneliness accompanied her, as faithful and inescapable as a shadow. One might imagine her seated in a lavish train carriage, the velvet upholstery soft beneath her, the lamps glowing warmly against the dark of the window. Outside, villages and forests swept past, unseen, their lights flickering like distant stars. Within, attendants served meals on silver, poured wine into crystal. To the casual observer, it was a scene of privilege, of refinement. Yet what is comfort when there is no companion to share it? Barbara often sat alone, her thoughts louder than the wheels clattering on the rails. She carried trunks filled with gowns and jewels, but her heart carried only questions. Where was love to be found, and why did it always elude her? Her wanderings took her across Europe, into cities rich with history and culture. Paris, with its boulevards alive with laughter and music, London, with its fog-veiled streets and echo of empire, Rome, where ancient ruins stood like reminders of the futility of grandeur. She walked through galleries, attended banquets, met with dignitaries and artists. And yet even in these circles of brilliance, she remained somehow apart, a solitary figure moving through the noise of others' lives. It was as if she were forever enclosed in glass, visible to all, admired from every angle but untouchable, unreachable, hidden behind the invisible barrier of her wealth and her longing. Sometimes she traveled to quieter places, seeking solace in landscapes rather than in salons. The sea seemed to speak to her with a voice more honest than society's chatter. Standing on the deck of a ship, she would gaze at the endless horizon, the wind pulling at her hair, the salt air clinging to her skin. There was in the sea a vastness that mirrored her own emptiness, and in its ceaseless waves, a rhythm that seemed to echo her own restless heart. She did not find answers there, but perhaps she found a certain peace in knowing that the sea, too, was endless and searching, never still. Travel, however, can only distract, not heal. The memories she carried remained unshaken. The loss of her mother, the loneliness of her childhood, the disappointments of her first marriage. No train, no ship, no foreign city could erase them. They clung to her as tightly as her gowns, as constant as her jewels. Yet she continued to move, as though motion itself might transform sorrow into something more bearable. Perhaps she believed, even unconsciously that if she kept going, she might stumble upon a place or a moment where love would finally find her. Her companions during these journeys were many and shifting. She gathered acquaintances, friends of convenience, admirers who stayed for a season. Some were dazzled by her generosity. Barbara was known for her kindness, for her willingness to share her fortune with those in need. She gave gifts freely, sometimes extravagantly, as though by giving she might bind others to her, as though loyalty might be purchased where love could not be assured. But generosity, though noble, often invited exploitation. Again and again she discovered that her gifts were received without gratitude, her trust met with betrayal. And so her circle shifted, faces changed, but the underlying loneliness remained unchanged. There were moments of light amid the shadows. She loved beauty, and beauty loved her. In gardens filled with roses, in the soft glow of sunset over foreign harbors, in the quiet of mountain air, she found glimpses of something that soothed her spirit. Her appreciation of art, of music, of elegance in all its forms gave her life a texture beyond sorrow. She adorned herself with jewels not merely as symbols of wealth, but as shields, as small pieces of beauty she could carry upon her body, armor against the darkness within. Yet even beauty, when not shared, becomes another form of solitude. The jewel sparkles, but who will see it with you? The garden blooms, but who will sit beside you in its fragrance? The pattern of Barbara's life during these years became one of movement without arrival. A city entered, a city left. A companion found, a companion lost. Each departure carried with it the faint hope of renewal, and each arrival eventually revealed the same truth. Her heart remained unfulfilled. The train whistle that carried her through the night was less a call toward destination than a reminder of her endless wandering. And yet, can we not understand this restlessness? Is it not a mirror of the human condition itself, our constant search for meaning, for connection, for that which might finally complete us? In Barbara's wanderings, we see not merely the travels of a rich heiress, but the longing of a soul unanchored, moving through the world in search of something she could never quite name. Her journeys across continents were not merely geographical. They were emotional pilgrimages, attempts to reconcile the irreconcilable. She hoped to escape the memories that haunted her, yet in every foreign land she found them waiting. She sought love, yet too often found only mirrors of her own longing reflected back at her. And still she persisted, as though by sheer motion she could outrun the shadow that followed her. It is in this restless period of her life that we see the deep pattern forming, the pursuit of escape, the return of disappointment, the repetition of wounds. And yet within it, too, lies her enduring resilience. For though she was often betrayed, though her travels ended as they began, she did not cease to hope. She continued to seek, to extend her hand, to believe that love might yet be found. The whistle of the train fades again into silence, and we see her seated once more, gazing out at the passing landscape, her face illuminated by the glow of the carriage lamp. The world outside rushes by in a blur, but her eyes seem fixed not on what is visible, but on something inward, something unseen. It is the look of a woman searching not for cities or scenery, but for belonging, for the simple presence of another hand that will not withdraw. And so her travels carried her forward, and with them the next chapter of her life. The carousel of marriages that would follow, each one entered with hope, each one dissolving in disillusionment. Princes, playboys, even a movie star would take their place beside her, each promising companionship, each leaving behind only another layer of sorrow. But for now, we leave her with the sound of that train, its whistle haunting the night, carrying her through landscapes foreign and familiar, the endless journey of a heart that could never find its home. The whistle of the train faded into distance, and in its place came the image of a door left slightly ajar, the wind moving softly through, carrying with it a sense of uncertainty, of things unfinished, of promises not yet sealed but already fragile. This door might well symbolize the threshold Barbara Hutton crossed as she entered into marriage again and again, each time believing she was stepping into a room of warmth and permanence, yet each time finding only drafts of disappointment. The cycle of her unions became like the seasons, returning with regularity, filled with blossoms of hope that soon withered into the familiar chill of betrayal. After Alexis Medivani, the so-called prince who had drained her fortune with careless indulgence, Barbara continued her search for love with a determination that seemed both brave and desperate. The world, meanwhile, watched her choices with fascination and with judgment, each new marriage providing society with another chapter to consume, another headline to adorn with the phrase, "poor little rich girl." To outsiders, it may have seemed like frivolity, the restless indulgence of a spoiled heiress. But beneath the glitter, beneath the names and titles, there was a woman searching with aching sincerity for what her childhood had denied her: steadfast love. Her marriages became a carousel, turning slowly, each figure brightly painted, each ride beginning with excitement and ending with disillusionment. Dukes, barons, counts, playboys, actors, all were drawn to her, and she to them. There was the Danish count, Kurt von Haugwitz-Reventlow, with whom she would have her only son, Lance. There was Cary Grant, the movie star whose name brought glamour even to her already luminous circle. There were others, each with their own allure, their own promise. Yet through all of them, the pattern repeated: charm followed by fracture, hope followed by heartbreak. It is tempting to view these marriages only in terms of scandal or folly, as the newspapers so often did. But if one listens more carefully, with sympathy rather than scorn, a different melody emerges. Barbara was not reckless for the sake of drama. She was relentless in her search for connection. Each marriage was an attempt, sincere in its beginning, to find the hand that would remain steady, the embrace that would not withdraw. And each failure was not merely a public embarrassment, but a private echo of the loss that had shaped her since childhood. Consider, dear listener, the courage it takes to love again after betrayal. Most of us, wounded once, hesitate long before opening our hearts anew. Barbara, wounded repeatedly, still stepped through that door left ajar, still welcomed the wind that might chill her again because she could not resign herself to loneliness. Was this weakness? Or was it the most human strength, the refusal to abandon hope, even when hope had so often deceived her? The marriages themselves, though varied in detail, shared a haunting similarity. At first, there was glamour. Barbara and her partner photographed together in yachts, at parties, on the steps of grand hotels. Then there were whispers, rumors of quarrels, of financial disputes, of infidelities. And then, almost inevitably, there was separation, sometimes bitter, sometimes quiet, but always leaving Barbara more fragile than before. Each husband took with him not only a share of her fortune, but also a fragment of her trust, until she seemed to move through life with less of both. Cary Grant perhaps stands apart in this pattern, for he was said to treat her with more kindness than most. Their marriage, though brief, lacked the cruelty of some of her other unions. And yet even with him, the marriage did not endure, proving again that even charm and gentleness were not enough to sustain the deep hunger of her heart. Barbara needed not only affection, but permanence. And permanence was the one thing she was never able to find. The wind that moved through the door of each marriage carried with it not only loss, but also scandal. Society delighted in her misfortunes, as though her wealth excused the cruelty of mockery. Headlines chronicled her divorces with relish, portraying her not as a woman of depth, but as a spectacle of excess. The title "Poor Little Rich Girl" became less a description than a brand, repeated endlessly until it seemed to erase her humanity. How must it have felt to see one's pain turned into entertainment for strangers? To be known not for one's heart, but for one's failures? And yet Barbara endured it all with a kind of weary grace. She withdrew at times, retreated into quieter spaces, but she never ceased to extend her hand again. Each new marriage, each new attempt was both an act of hope and an act of defiance against the narrative imposed upon her. The world might call her foolish, but she knew within herself that she was only searching for what every human being desires: love that is true. In this carousel of unions, the pattern of her life crystallized. Wealth, instead of protecting her, had made her vulnerable, attracting those who sought fortune rather than affection. Beauty, instead of guaranteeing devotion, became another mask that suitors wore lightly, discarding it when their interest waned. And Barbara herself, though generous and kind, could not overcome the shadows that followed her: suspicion, betrayal, abandonment. One can almost imagine the rooms she inhabited during these years, rooms in hotels, in villas, in grand estates, each one decorated with the finest furnishings, each one filled with the faint sound of voices and laughter that eventually faded into silence. The door left ajar becomes a recurring image: the promise of someone entering, the fear of someone leaving, the draft of loneliness that never ceased to move through her life. Is it not telling, dear listener, that despite all her fortune, Barbara Hutton lived as if always on the threshold, never fully at home in any love, never secure within any marriage? The door never closed firmly with the comfort of permanence. It always remained ajar, the wind moving through, carrying with it the inevitability of loss. And so this part of her story leaves us with that image: a woman standing in a doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame, her gaze turned toward the uncertain space beyond. Behind her lie the ruins of marriages past. Before her lies the possibility of another beginning. The wind stirs her hair, carries the faint scent of roses from a garden nearby, mingles with the salt of distant seas. She pauses, as if to listen. Is it the sound of footsteps approaching, or footsteps fading away? She cannot yet tell, and so she waits, poised between hope and resignation, between the promise of love and the certainty of solitude. The door remained ajar, the draft of loneliness moving softly through, and in its restless current, the candlelight began to flicker, each flame bending, trembling, as though it might at any moment vanish into smoke. This image captures the nature of Barbara Hutton's friendships, fragile and uncertain, burning briefly with warmth, yet always vulnerable to betrayal, to the chill of indifference, to the quiet extinguishing that left her once more in the dark. For though she was known across the world for her fortune and her beauty, Barbara yearned not only for love in marriage, but also for the companionship of friends who might remain steadfast, who might hold her secrets gently rather than scatter them into the winds of gossip. She sought confidants in many places: in the salons of Paris, in the drawing rooms of London, in the private corners of Beverly Hills. Artists, aristocrats, actresses, socialites, many passed through her life, sharing laughter, listening to her hopes, accepting her generosity. Barbara was a giving friend, eager to offer gifts, to provide comfort, to make those around her feel cherished. Yet too often, her kindness was taken as opportunity rather than blessing. For the wealthy attract not only admirers, but opportunists, those who smile sweetly while calculating what might be gained. It is said that Barbara's generosity was immense, that she would bestow jewels, money, and favors upon friends with little hesitation. Perhaps she believed that giving would bind them closer, that loyalty might be purchased in the currency she had in such abundance. But true friendship, as she discovered again and again, cannot be bought. Those who accepted her gifts too often betrayed her trust, whispering her secrets into the ears of others, mocking her behind closed doors, or abandoning her in her hours of need. The candle flame flickers most when the air is restless, and in Barbara's world the air was never still. Gossip swirled like smoke around her name, newspapers echoing it, acquaintances repeating it, friends disguising cruelty as casual chatter. In such a climate, how could trust endure? Each new friendship began with the glow of promise, but soon the flame bent, trembled, and faded, leaving only the faint smell of smoke and the ache of betrayal. Yet Barbara did not cease to hope, for her need for companionship was too deep. She extended her hand again and again, welcoming new confidants into her circle, sharing her thoughts, her sorrows, her dreams. She longed to be understood, to be seen not as the poor little rich girl, but as a woman of depth, of fragility, of humanity. There were moments when she believed she had found such understanding, when laughter shared over late-night conversations seemed genuine, when a friend's embrace felt steady. But sooner or later, the flickering began, and the flame once more threatened to extinguish. One must wonder how it felt to live surrounded by people and yet so often alone. She attended gatherings where her name commanded attention, yet when the music ended and the guests departed, the silence pressed heavily upon her. Friends who delighted in her company when the champagne flowed and the chandeliers glittered were less present when sorrow weighed upon her. In times of need, she discovered how swiftly the room could empty, how quickly the flames could die. And still she gave. Her heart, though bruised, remained generous. Perhaps she believed that by giving she could conjure the loyalty she craved. Or perhaps giving was her way of expressing love in a world where she so rarely received it. Whatever the reason, it left her vulnerable, her fortune diminished, her spirit more weary with each betrayal. She was, in the words of some who knew her, too trusting, too eager to see goodness in others, too willing to forgive. And yet, is that not also a form of beauty, to persist in kindness even when kindness is not returned? There were a few friendships that endured more faithfully, though even these were often strained by the currents of her life. Some companions loved her sincerely, saw her not as a source of wealth, but as a fragile soul in need of care. Yet such figures were rare and often drowned out by the louder chorus of opportunists. The candle that burned steadily was easily overshadowed by those that flickered, threatened, and died. It is said that Barbara's vulnerability was apparent even in her manner, in the softness of her voice, in the gentleness of her smile. Those who met her often remarked that despite her fortune, she seemed less like a woman of power and more like a woman in need of protection. Such vulnerability invited both compassion and exploitation. Some were moved to shield her, others were tempted to take advantage, and too often the latter prevailed. Is it not one of life's cruelties that those who need loyalty most are often those who encounter it least? The child who cried in the vast corridors of her home, the young woman whose suitors withdrew their hands, the heiress whose marriages dissolved into disappointment. She carried these wounds into her friendships, hoping that companions might soothe them. Instead, too many sharpened the pain, leaving her more wounded than before. And yet, despite it all, Barbara's spirit retained a certain resilience. Though the flames flickered and died, she continued to light new candles, to invite new faces into her life, to believe, however tentatively, that companionship might yet endure. There is something profoundly human in this refusal to surrender hope, in this insistence on seeking connection despite repeated betrayals. It is easy to call it naivete, but perhaps it is better understood as faith. The faith that love and loyalty, though rare, are not impossible. The image of candlelight flickering remains with us as we consider this chapter of her life. Each flame burns with promise, glows warmly for a time, then bends, trembles, and fades. In the end, Barbara often found herself in darkness, the air heavy with the smell of extinguished wicks. Yet even in the darkness, she reached for matches, lit new candles, watched them glow, and hoped again. And so we leave her in a room where candlelight dances uncertainly upon the walls, shadows moving with each draft of air. The flames threaten to extinguish, but they endure a little longer, casting fragile warmth into the vastness around her. In this light, we glimpse Barbara herself, fragile, flickering, yet still present, still glowing, still refusing to surrender to the dark entirely. The candlelight flickered, bending with each restless breath of air, until at last there came the sound of a glass falling and breaking, its shatter sharp, sudden, and final. The fragments scattered across the floor, small and glittering like pieces of a world once whole and now undone. It is in this image that we glimpse Barbara Hutton's descent into the fragile realm of dependence, her struggles with medicines, with sedatives, with substances that promise to ease her pain, yet only deepen the fractures of her spirit. For when the weight of loneliness becomes unbearable, and when the betrayals of friends and lovers repeat without end, what does one reach for, if not the solace of forgetting? Barbara's life had always been watched, recorded, whispered about, her joys made into headlines and her sorrows turned into spectacle. To live under such a gaze is itself a heavy burden, and for one as sensitive as she, the pressure was immense. Already weakened by the wounds of childhood, already disillusioned by failed marriages and broken friendships, she sought in bottles and in powders the stillness that had eluded her everywhere else. Sedatives offered her sleep when sleep would not come, relief when memories pressed too tightly, silence when the noise of society overwhelmed her. Yet such relief is never without cost. What begins as comfort becomes necessity, and necessity becomes a chain as heavy as any gilded one. In rooms that had once been filled with music and laughter, there now grew an emptiness muffled by the sound of pills shaken into bottles, glasses filled with spirits, the quiet rituals of escape repeated night after night. The public saw only glimpses, a faint slurring of words at a party, a weariness in her step, a face grown pale and fragile. But behind closed doors, the struggle was more constant, more consuming. Each dose promised release, and for a few hours it gave it. But upon waking, the loneliness was still there, sharper for being momentarily hidden. How often have human beings across all centuries sought comfort in substances that numb rather than heal? The story of Barbara's dependence is not unique in this. It is part of a larger human story, the endless search for ease, the desire to quiet the restless heart. Yet in her case, the tragedy was sharpened by her visibility. Each stumble, each sign of frailty became fodder for gossip, reported in tones half mocking, half pitying. To be broken in private is one sorrow. To be broken in public is another, heavier still. The glass that shattered symbolizes more than a single moment. It is the shattering of promises, of health, of dignity. It is the reminder that even the strongest vessels can break when dropped too often. Barbara's body, once radiant, grew thin, fragile, marked by the toll of substances taken in hope of relief. Her spirit, already bruised, grew weary beneath the weight of dependence. And yet, even in this decline, she remained a figure of grace in the eyes of many, her elegance never entirely abandoned, her kindness still evident in gestures of generosity. This, too, is part of the paradox, that even in her frailty she carried beauty, a kind of fragile nobility that could not be erased. But one must ask, what drove her deeper into this spiral? Was it only the loneliness of her childhood, the betrayals of her marriages, the fragility of her friendships? Or was there something more, something in the very nature of her existence as heiress, as public figure, as symbol of wealth. For to live as Barbara did was to live in a cage gilded beyond measure, admired but never free. And perhaps the substances she turned to were not only to ease her sorrow, but to give her, however briefly, the illusion of escape. Her son, Lance, was at times a light in this darkness, a reason to endure, a presence that anchored her briefly in love. Yet even motherhood, though it brought her joy, could not entirely heal the wounds within. And as Lance grew, as he moved into his own life, Barbara remained with her own emptiness, turning again to the fragile comforts of medicine. It is one of the cruelest truths of human existence that love, even when real, does not always cure the wounds of the past. In the quiet of her rooms, Barbara must have often listened to the silence that followed the breaking of a glass, the silence that came after the swallow of a pill. That silence was what she craved, yet it was also what she feared, for it reminded her that the world within was still unresolved. Perhaps she hoped that with enough forgetting, the echoes of her childhood, the betrayals of her marriages, the gossip of her so-called friends would dissolve into nothingness. But forgetting is never complete. Memory remains, waiting, patient, ready to return as soon as the medicine fades. And so her life in these years became a cycle. Hope for love, disappointment, retreat into substances, brief relief, return of pain. Again and again, the cycle turned, each time leaving her more fragile, more exhausted. She had wealth enough to purchase any cure the world could offer, but no cure could mend the heart. She had access to doctors, to treatments, to every resource of her era, yet still the solution eluded her. For what she needed was not medicine but love, not sedation but presence, not forgetting but healing. And those were gifts no fortune could buy. The image of the broken glass remains, shards glinting on the floor, dangerous to touch, beautiful in their own way, reflecting the light even as they remind us of what has been destroyed. Barbara herself was like that. Broken in many ways, yet still capable of reflecting beauty, still luminous in her fragility. Those who loved her, however briefly, often spoke of her gentleness, her generosity, her kindness. She was not hardened by her disappointments, but rather softened, as though sorrow had worn away her defenses and left her vulnerable, exposed. It is here that we must pause, dear listener, and reflect upon the nature of fragility. We live in a world that often praises strength, resilience, unyielding will. But is there not also a strange beauty in the fragile, in the delicate, in the soul that trembles yet endures? Barbara's struggles with addiction were tragic, yes, but they were also human, deeply human. Reminders that even those who seem to have everything are not spared the common sorrows of existence. And so this part of her story ends with the sound of broken glass, its fragments scattered, catching the flicker of candlelight. The room is silent save for the faint rustle of curtains as the wind moves through. In this silence we see Barbara, weary, vulnerable, seeking comfort in fragile remedies, her heart still aching, her spirit still restless. The glass cannot be mended, the pieces cannot be restored, but still they glint, still they catch the light, reminding us that even in brokenness there is a kind of beauty that endures. The glass lay shattered, its fragments catching the unsteady light, and into that silence there came a new sound, unexpected and sweet, the laughter of a child, bright and echoing, carrying within it a music that no orchestra could imitate. For in the midst of her struggles, her betrayals, her dependence upon fragile comforts, Barbara Hutton was given something she had longed for more deeply than jewels or titles, her son, Lance. His arrival was like the sudden bloom of a flower in barren soil, a sign of life where there had been only weariness. For a time, he gave her what no medicine could, a reason to hope, to rise, to endure. Lance Reventlow was born of her marriage to Count Kurt von Haugwitz, Reventlow, a man of nobility and ambition whose union with Barbara was turbulent, even cruel, but whose legacy in her life was this child. The marriage itself was a storm, filled with quarrels and accusations, and Kurt, by many accounts, treated her harshly, seeking to dominate rather than cherish. Yet out of that storm came a son, and in him Barbara discovered the only relationship of her life that was not shadowed by suspicion, calculation, or betrayal. A mother's love, unconditional and unmeasured, offered her a form of companionship she had never known before. She adored him with a devotion that astonished those who knew her. To Barbara, Lance was not merely her child, but her anchor, her proof that love could be real, that it could exist free of greed. She held him in her arms with a tenderness she herself had been denied, whispering lullabies into his ear as though to soothe not only his spirit, but her own. The emptiness of her childhood, the long corridors of loneliness, seemed for a while to fade, replaced by the simple sound of his laughter, the warmth of his small hand clutching hers. Photographs from these years show Barbara radiant in a way that no jewel or gown could imitate. Her smile, often strained in society's ballrooms, appeared genuine when she was with Lance. He gave her life a focus beyond herself, a purpose that transcended the endless cycle of marriages and betrayals. In caring for him, she cared also for the wounded child within her, the girl who had cried for her mother in vain. Through motherhood, she found a measure of healing, however fragile, however temporary. But Barbara's life was never free of turmoil. Her marriage to Kurt was fraught with bitterness. He sought control not only over her fortune, but also over her role as a mother. Legal battles and quarrels scarred the years when she should have known peace. Yet through it all, Barbara clung to her bond with Lance. Even when courts and guardians attempted to interfere, even when gossip sought to stain her name, her devotion to him did not falter. He was the one light that endured in her storm, the one presence she trusted without doubt. Is it not telling, dear listener, that the only place Barbara found true certainty was in the embrace of her child? All her wealth, all her marriages, all her friendships had failed to provide it. Yet in the laughter of a boy, she discovered what she had been searching for all along, a love untainted, a loyalty unshaken. Perhaps this is why she lavished upon him not only gifts, but also the deepest affection of her heart. She wished to give him what she had never received, a sense of being cherished, of being secure, of knowing that he was wanted beyond measure. As Lance grew, he became more than a child to her. He became her companion, her confidant, the figure around whom her days revolved. She followed his interests, encouraged his passions, watched with pride as he grew into a young man of talent and charm. He loved cars, speed, adventure, and Barbara, though fearful, supported his ambitions. For a mother's love is not the kind that holds tightly to prevent risk, but the kind that hopes, even while trembling, that the child will find joy. The echo of his laughter followed her into rooms otherwise heavy with silence. It filled her houses, her gardens, her travels. When he was near, the shadows of her addiction seemed to lessen, the need for sedation diminished. He gave her a reason to rise from bed, to dress, to smile, to move forward. For once the fragments of the broken glass seemed to reflect not only sorrow but also hope, shimmering with the possibility of renewal. And yet, even this brightest light in Barbara's life carried the shadow of uncertainty. For the world around her remained restless. The gossip continued. The pressures of society did not abate. She worried for him, for his future, for the ways her own life might cast shadows upon his. Was he destined to inherit not only her wealth, but also her burdens? Would the curse of fortune extend to him as it had to her? These questions lingered in her mind, even as she cherished the present joy of his presence. Still, she treasured him. For in the sound of his laughter she heard the music she had longed for since childhood. It was not the applause of ballrooms, not the cheers of society, not the clinking of glasses or the whispers of admirers. It was simple, pure, human. It was the sound of belonging. And for Barbara, it was enough to believe, if only for a time, that her story might yet have a measure of happiness. The years with Lance were perhaps the closest she came to peace. They did not erase her past nor prevent her future sorrows, but they gave her a reason to endure them. For a mother's love, unlike the flickering flame of friendship or the broken promises of marriage, is not so easily extinguished. It burns steadily, even in the darkest night, even when the wind moves through the door, even when the glass has shattered. And so we see her in this chapter of her life, not as the poor little rich girl mocked by the world, but as a mother, tender and radiant, holding her son close, finding in him the refuge that had always eluded her. His laughter echoes through the halls, bright and unbroken, filling the emptiness with warmth. For once she is not alone, yet the image is not without its shadows, for the world is ever uncertain, and the flame of joy, though bright, can be fragile. The laughter that fills her home will one day be silenced, not by betrayal but by fate, in a tragedy that will undo her more completely than any failed marriage or broken friendship ever could. But for now, in this moment, we leave her with the sound of her son's laughter echoing in her heart, a melody of love that, however briefly, allowed her to believe that happiness was possible. The echo of her son's laughter lingered in the air like the final notes of a song, bright and sweet, yet already fading into distance. And then, as so often happens in lives touched by fate, the sky began to change. A storm cloud moved slowly across the heavens, heavy, dark, unyielding, its shadow stretching over everything below. For Barbara Hutton, that storm cloud was the moment when fate claimed the one gift she had treasured above all others, the son who had been her light, her anchor, her proof that love could be real. Lance Raventlow, grown into a man of charm and daring, lost his life in a plane crash in 1972, and with him vanished the last fragile thread of hope that held her heart together. It is difficult to speak of such a loss without falling into silence, for what words can capture the weight of a mother losing her only child? Barbara had endured betrayals, divorces, scandals, illnesses, the cruelties of gossip, the frailty of friendships. Through all of it, she had survived, clinging to the sound of her son's laughter as proof that the world still held meaning. And then, in one sudden, shattering moment, even that was gone. The storm cloud passed over her life and left behind a darkness deeper than any she had known before. Lance had been the center of her affection, the one presence that made her believe she was not cursed, that her wealth had not robbed her of everything that mattered. He was young, full of energy, passionate about cars, about racing, about speed. Barbara worried for him, as mothers always worry, but she loved him enough to let him pursue his passions, even when they filled her with fear. She had seen him grow from the child whose laughter filled her halls into the man whose ambition carried him into the skies. And then the news came. A small plane, a crash in the mountains of Colorado, no survivors. The words were stark, merciless, final. The moment she learned of his death is one we can only imagine, yet it is not difficult to picture. The silence of a room suddenly broken by the words, "No mother should ever hear," the way the body weakens under the weight of grief, the way breath becomes a struggle, the way memory rushes in with unbearable force. Perhaps she saw his face as a child laughing in her arms. Perhaps she remembered his voice, his hands, the way he had once anchored her to life. And then she understood, with a clarity sharper than any other pain, she would never see him again, never hear him again, never hold him again. This was the moment when the storm cloud settled over her life and refused to lift. She had survived many losses, but this was the loss that undid her completely. Friends came, doctors came, reporters came, each offering their words, their judgments, their pity. But none of it mattered. What comfort can the world give to a mother whose child has been taken? Barbara was left adrift, her anchor torn away, her heart hollowed out by grief too great for words. Is it not true, dear listener, that wealth is powerless before death? Money can build palaces, buy jewels, secure doctors, surround one with attendants, but it cannot prevent the hand of fate from closing around the ones we love. Barbara had been called one of the richest women in the world, yet in that moment she was poorer than anyone, bereft of the only treasure she truly valued. The irony of her nickname, the poor little rich girl, reached its cruelest truth here. Rich beyond measure, she was poor beyond imagining. In the years that followed Lance's death, Barbara withdrew more deeply into herself. The sparkle that had once lit her smile, however briefly, was gone. Her health, already fragile, deteriorated further. The substances she had once used to numb her sorrows became a heavier dependence, for now the sorrow was greater than ever. Friends who had remained drifted away, unable or unwilling to share in the depth of her grief. She became a figure of solitude, a ghost of her former self, moving through the world without purpose, carrying a burden too heavy to lay down. Those who saw her in these years spoke of her as frail, almost ethereal, as though she were fading before their eyes. The once vibrant heiress who had dazzled ballrooms and filled newspapers with scandal became instead a woman who seemed to belong more to the shadows than to the light. And always, within her, was the memory of Lance, the laughter that once had saved her now transformed into an echo that haunted her days. We may wonder, was this the true breaking point of her life? Or had she always been breaking, little by little, from the moment she lost her mother as a child? Perhaps every wound she endured, every betrayal, every disappointment was a preparation for this final wound, though nothing could truly prepare her. Her life, already marked by tragedy, became defined by it, and the story of Barbara Hutton entered its final, darkest chapter. Yet even in this sorrow, we must pause to remember the love that made it possible, for grief of such magnitude is born only of love of equal depth. Barbara's devotion to her son was pure, untainted, unlike her marriages, unlike her friendships. And though his death broke her, it also testifies to the reality that she was capable of love, that she was not merely an heiress surrounded by wealth, but a mother who cherished her child. In this, she was entirely human, her sorrow a reflection of her humanity, her love a truth that no gossip, no scandal, no fortune could erase. The storm cloud moved across the sky, casting shadows long and heavy. Beneath it stood Barbara, small, frail, her heart shattered, her spirit weary. She had lost her anchor, and with it the last reason to believe in the promise of happiness. The cloud did not pass. The storm did not break. It remained, darkening her days, weighing upon her nights, until she herself began to fade into the twilight of her own life. And so we leave her here, beneath that storm, her son gone, her laughter silenced, her love turned into grief. The image is stark, almost unbearable. A woman who had everything the world could offer, yet who stood bereft of the one thing she needed most. The storm cloud drifts slowly, endlessly across the sky, and beneath it Barbara Hutton lingers, a figure of sorrow, her story deepened into tragedy beyond measure. The storm cloud lingered above her, heavy and unyielding, and in the silence beneath it there came the steady sound of a clock ticking in an empty room. Each second fell with soft insistence, marking not triumphs nor joys, but the slow decline of a life that had once been filled with music and glitter. For Barbara Hutton, the years after her son's death were measured not by celebrations, but by the passage of time itself. Each tick another reminder of her fragility, her fading health, and the erosion of the immense fortune that had defined her existence. She had once been among the richest women in the world, inheritor of the Woolworth legacy, a name synonymous with abundance. But wealth, like health, is not immune to decline. Through her generosity, her lavish spending, the predations of husbands and acquaintances, and the simple erosion of mismanagement, her fortune dwindled. Mansions that once echoed with parties stood empty, jewels that once dazzled were sold, estates were relinquished. It seemed as though her wealth, like her health, was slipping away one piece at a time, until she lived not in palaces but in rented rooms, surrounded less by splendor than by shadows. Her body, too, bore the marks of decline. Years of dependence on sedatives and alcohol had left her frail, her once luminous beauty now fragile, her movements unsteady. Those who saw her in her later years spoke of her as ghost-like, a figure whose presence seemed half in this world, half already departing. Her face, still carrying traces of elegance, was lined with sorrow. Her frame, once adorned in gowns of the finest silk, grew thin, delicate, vulnerable. The vitality that had carried her through ballrooms and across continents had ebbed, leaving behind a woman marked by weariness. The empty rooms she inhabited seemed to mirror her own state. Where once there had been laughter, now there was silence. Where once there had been gatherings of friends and admirers, now there was solitude. The ticking of the clock was often the loudest sound, echoing through spaces that felt larger for being empty. She had been surrounded by people her entire life, but in these later years, she discovered that solitude, once forced upon her in childhood, had returned as her final companion. And yet, even in this decline, there remained a certain dignity. Barbara did not rage publicly against her fate. She accepted it with quiet resignation, as though she had long known that the glitter of her early years could not endure. She had been called foolish, reckless, indulgent. But she had also been generous, kind, compassionate. Those who truly knew her remembered not her extravagance, but her willingness to give, her gentleness of spirit. And in these final years, though her fortune diminished and her health faltered, that gentleness did not abandon her. The newspapers, of course, continued their fascination. They chronicled her decline as they had chronicled her youth, speaking of lost millions, of faded beauty, of the heiress who had squandered her fortune. The phrase "poor little rich girl" was repeated once again, as though it were the only story the world could tell about her. But behind the headlines was a reality far more human, an aging woman, alone, fragile, listening to the ticking of clocks in rooms that no longer held the warmth of companionship. Is it not curious, dear listener, how time itself becomes both friend and enemy in such moments? The clock, steady and unchanging, offers order in the midst of decline, a rhythm when all else falters. Yet it is also a reminder of what cannot be reclaimed, of years slipping away, of opportunities lost. For Barbara, each tick was perhaps both comfort and cruelty, a sound that reminded her she was still here, yet also that her time was running out. She had once been able to command the attention of the world with the mere mention of her name. Now she lived quietly, her presence fading from public life, her days marked more by memory than by events. The storm cloud of her son's death never lifted, and beneath its shadow she grew weaker, retreating further into solitude. And yet one must imagine that within her the memories of earlier years still stirred. The brilliance of her 21st birthday ball, the thrill of travel, the laughter of her child. Time may erode the body and the fortune, but memory remains, however bittersweet, echoing like a ghost within the rooms of the heart. What lesson, if any, can be drawn from this decline? Was it inevitable that such wealth, such beauty, such fame would dissolve into solitude and frailty? Or was Barbara's fate shaped less by destiny than by the wounds she carried from childhood, wounds that no fortune could ever heal? Perhaps it is not for us to answer, but simply to witness, to hold her story as one holds a fragile object, aware of its delicacy, respectful of its sorrow. The ticking of the clock continues, steady and indifferent as Barbara Hutton sits alone in her room. Outside, the world moves on. New fashions, new scandals, new names to capture society's attention. But within her, the rhythm of her life has slowed, marked now only by the sound of seconds passing, by the fading of strength, by the gentle approach of the end. The heiress, once surrounded by opulence, now lives with little more than the essentials. The grandeur has faded, but the humanity remains. And so this chapter closes with the image of an empty room, dimly lit, the air still except for the sound of a clock. The hands move steadily, marking the passage of time, each tick a reminder of mortality, each talk an echo of the life once lived. Barbara sits within this room, her body frail, her fortune diminished, her spirit weary, yet still she endures, still she breathes, still she listens to the rhythm that carries her closer, to the silence that awaits us all. The clock ticked in the emptiness, its rhythm steady and indifferent, until another sound rose to join it. The rustling of newspaper pages caught in the wind, turned over on sidewalks, forgotten by readers who had already consumed their stories. In those pages, Barbara Hutton's name still appeared, not with the glamour of her youth, but with the cruelty of repetition, the world reminding her once more of the title it had given her so long ago, the poor little rich girl. The phrase, so deceptively simple, became like a chain around her identity, a label that outlived her joys, her tragedies, and her very sense of self. The newspapers delighted in contrasts. They reminded the public of the vast fortune she had once inherited, of the jewels she had worn, of the palaces she had inhabited. Then, in sharp strokes, they described her decline, her health failing, her fortune diminished, her solitude deepening. They cast her life as a cautionary tale, as though she had squandered not merely wealth, but the very essence of human opportunity. Rarely did they write of her generosity, her longing for love, her fragility. Such things did not fill columns as neatly as scandal or decline. The phrase, poor little rich girl, had followed her since her 21st birthday, when the world first discovered the heiress who inherited more than most kingdoms possessed. At first it was used with a tone of curiosity, a fascination with the irony of wealth paired with sorrow. But as the years passed and her troubles multiplied, the phrase hardened into mockery. It became not a description but a verdict, a way of dismissing her humanity, reducing her entire existence to a paradox made for headlines. Imagine, dear listener, what it must feel like to see one's life reduced to such words, printed again and again, carried by winds through streets and cafes, whispered in parlors and repeated at dinner tables. To Barbara, each repetition must have felt like an echo of the same wound, reminding her that the world did not see her as a woman, but as a symbol, a story to be told for the entertainment of others. Yet words have power, and names given by others can shape the way one sees oneself. Did Barbara, in her quiet moments, come to believe in that phrase? Did she look at herself in the mirror, her body frail, her face marked by sorrow, and whisper the words the world had given her? Or did she resist them, holding within herself the stubborn truth that she was more than the sum of her tragedies? These are questions we cannot answer, for she spoke rarely of her inner life, preferring silence to confession. But the persistence of the phrase suggests that it pressed heavily upon her, whether she resisted it or not. The newspapers did not see the whole of her. They did not see the nights when she sat quietly in her room, remembering her son's laughter. They did not see the moments of kindness when she gave to those in need, often without announcing it. They did not see the fragile courage it took for her to continue moving forward, even when everything seemed lost. They saw only the surface, and they judged her by it, as the world so often does. Is it not the way of society to simplify, to reduce complexity into phrases, to turn human beings into stories? We do it still today, with names repeated in headlines, with reputations made into symbols. But behind every phrase is a life, vast and uncontainable, filled with moments unseen, with depths unknown. Barbara Hutton was never simply the poor little rich girl. She was a daughter who lost her mother too soon, a woman who longed for love, a mother who cherished her son, a figure of generosity, a soul of fragility. To reduce her to a phrase is to deny her humanity, to silence the subtler truths of her existence. And yet, the phrase endured. The papers rustled in the wind, carrying it into every corner of the world. Each time she appeared in public, the phrase resurfaced. Each time her fortune waned, it was repeated. Each failed marriage, each sign of frailty, each gesture of despair was framed by it. To the world, she was not Barbara Hutton, a human being of complexity and contradiction. She was a cautionary figure, an object of fascination, a symbol of how wealth cannot purchase happiness. Barbara herself seemed to accept this with weary resignation. She did not fight the phrase publicly, did not demand a different narrative. Perhaps she lacked the strength. Perhaps she knew it was futile to contest the voice of the world. But within herself, she must have felt the sting of being misseen, misnamed. For what greater loneliness is there than to be known only falsely, to be seen only in fragments, to be denied the fullness of one's truth? The rustling of newspapers in the wind becomes, then, an image of this stage of her life. Pages turn, words scatter, stories circulate, but none of them capture the essence of the woman they claim to describe. The public consumes the story, then discards it, moving on to the next scandal, the next paradox. Barbara remains alone in her room, listening not to applause or laughter, but to the relentless ticking of the clock and the whispers of headlines that will not let her go. In this, her story reflects not only her own fate, but the cruelty of fame itself. For those who are made into symbols rarely escape their symbols. The public, once it names someone, holds them to that name forever, unwilling to allow change, unwilling to acknowledge complexity. Barbara was named the poor little rich girl, and in the eyes of the world she could never be anything else. Even her generosity, her motherhood, her small acts of grace were swallowed by the shadow of that phrase. And so this chapter ends with the sound of pages rustling in the wind, carried down empty streets, past figures who scarcely pause to read them. The phrase appears again, bold and simple, as though it contains her entire life. But you and I, dear listener, know better. We know that behind the phrase was a woman, fragile and luminous, broken and generous, longing and enduring. The papers rustle, but the truth remains elsewhere, hidden in the spaces no headline could ever reach. The pages rustled in the wind, carrying words that reduced her life to a phrase, and as they settled into silence, another sound rose to replace them. The soft whisper of silk brushing against the floor, the delicate swish of fabric that follows a woman's step. For despite all the cruelty of headlines, despite the erosion of her fortune and the decline of her health, Barbara Hutton never abandoned her devotion to beauty. Fashion, jewels, the art of elegance, these remained with her as both expression and shield, a way of crafting dignity even when the world sought only to strip it away. She'd been raised in a world where appearance mattered, where clothes were not mere garments but symbols, where the cut of a gown or the sparkle of a necklace announced one's place in the hierarchy of society. Yet for Barbara, beauty was not simply display. It was a language, a form of survival. When all else failed, when marriages collapsed, when friendships betrayed, when newspapers mocked, she could still wrap herself in silk, adorn herself with jewels, and face the world with a grace that belied her fragility. In this, fashion was not frivolity. It was armor. The sound of silk brushing across marble floors followed her into countless rooms. She walked into ballrooms wearing gowns that shimmered like moonlight, their lines flowing with a quiet majesty. She sat at dinner tables where diamonds caught the light of chandeliers, their brilliance reflecting not merely wealth, but her refusal to surrender entirely to despair. Even in her later years, when her fortune had diminished, she still cared for her appearance, still sought beauty in fabric, in color, in form. It was as though she knew that to let beauty go would be to admit defeat, to allow sorrow to claim not only her heart, but her outward self. There is a paradox here, one worth pausing upon. Barbara was mocked for extravagance, accused of squandering wealth on fashion, on jewels, on luxuries. Yet can we not see that for her, these things were more than vanity? They were gestures of defiance. Each gown she wore, each necklace she clasped around her neck, was a way of saying, I am still here. I am still capable of radiance. The world may call me poor little rich girl, but I will not appear broken before its gaze. And yet beneath the silk, beneath the glitter of stones, Barbara remained the same fragile soul. The gowns could not heal her loneliness. The jewels could not restore her son. The silks could not silence the ticking of the clock in her empty rooms. But they offered something, however fleeting, a moment of beauty, a fragment of dignity, a reminder that she was more than her wounds. Sometimes that is all we have, the small rituals of care, the outward gestures that preserve a sense of self, even when the inner self trembles. Barbara loved jewels with a passion that bordered on reverence. She collected them not only for their value, but for their artistry, their light. Emeralds, sapphires, diamonds, each stone carried for her a fascination, a sense that within it dwelled something eternal. Perhaps she saw in jewels the permanence that eluded her in love. Marriages failed. Friendships dissolved, health faded, but the jewel remained what it was, brilliant, enduring, unchanging. In its hardness and clarity, she may have glimpsed the stability she longed for but could not find elsewhere. Yet even her jewels did not remain untouched by her decline. Many were sold piece by piece as her fortune dwindled. The very symbols of permanence slipped from her hands, leaving her once again with absence. But still she sought beauty wherever she could, if not in the possession of jewels, then in the drape of a gown, in the scent of flowers, in the elegance of a gesture. Beauty for Barbara was not optional. It was essential, the thread that held together the fabric of her life. Is it not curious, dear listener, how even in sorrow we cling to beauty? A widow wears black not only in grief but in dignity. A soldier polishes his boots even on the eve of battle. We adorn ourselves not always to impress others but to remind ourselves that we still belong to the world, that we have not surrendered entirely to despair. Barbara's silks and jewels were such reminders. She may have been wounded, mocked, diminished, but she remained radiant, at least in appearance. And sometimes appearance is all we have to carry us through. In this love of fashion, Barbara also revealed a side of herself often ignored by those who judged her appreciation of art. For fashion, when pursued sincerely, is a form of art. She understood fabrics, cuts, the play of light on surfaces. She selected not only for luxury, but for beauty, for harmony. In her choices, we glimpse a woman attuned to aesthetics, a woman who found meaning in the artistry of creation. It was perhaps one of the few areas where she could exert control, shaping beauty in a life otherwise shaped by forces beyond her will. And so the silk brushes across the floor once more, a sound delicate yet insistent, reminding us of Barbara's devotion to elegance. The newspapers may have rustled with cruel phrases, but within the rooms where she prepared herself for the world, there was still the whisper of fabric, the gleam of jewels, the quiet ritual of dressing not only the body but the spirit. She may have been fragile, but she refused to appear so, and in that refusal there was a kind of strength, however subtle. As she aged, her gowns grew less extravagant, her jewels fewer, yet the care remained. Even in her frailness, even as her health declined, she carried herself with grace. For Barbara Hutton, beauty was never about perfection, it was about survival. And though the world might never have understood, she understood herself, that without beauty, her life would have been unbearable. But with it, even for a moment, she could endure. And so this chapter closes with the soft sound of silk brushing the floor, a reminder that even in decline, even in sorrow, Barbara remained devoted to elegance. The fabric moves like a whisper through the stillness, a quiet defiance against the noise of the world. She walks forward, her steps slow, her figure fragile, yet still adorned in beauty, still refusing to surrender entirely. The silk brushed softly against the floor, its sound fading like a whisper into silence. And then another sound arose, subtle yet weighty. The clink of coins dropping into an unseen hand. For beneath the glamour and the scandal, behind the endless gossip of headlines and the shimmer of jewels, Barbara Hutton was also a giver. Her fortune, so often described as squandered on extravagance, was also poured into acts of charity, gestures of kindness, gifts that revealed her longing not only to adorn herself, but to ease the lives of others. It is a side of her story too often forgotten, for generosity is quieter than scandal, and newspapers seldom give as many lines to kindness as they do to folly. Barbara had inherited a fortune beyond imagining, and though much of it slipped away through marriages, betrayals, and indulgence, a significant share was also given freely. She donated to hospitals, to causes of health and welfare, to individuals in need. She supported children's charities, funded medical research, and in times of crisis she gave with an open hand. Some of her philanthropy was public, acknowledged in reports and records. Much more was private, offered quietly without the announcement of trumpets. She had no need for the recognition of her giving, for she gave not to be praised, but because she knew, perhaps better than most, what it meant to feel the ache of want, not the want of money, but the want of love, of kindness, of human care. Her generosity extended beyond institutions to individuals who crossed her path. Friends, acquaintances, even those who were scarcely more than strangers, found in her a benefactor, someone who would write a check, purchase a home, offer a gift when she sensed need. To some, this seemed reckless, another example of her supposed inability to manage her wealth. But to those who looked deeper, it was evidence of her heart. Barbara gave not because she was careless, but because she could not bear to see others suffer. Her compassion was genuine, and her willingness to give was a way of reaching out, of creating the connection she so desperately longed for in return. The echo of coins falling into an unseen hand carries with it a paradox, for while Barbara gave freely, hoping perhaps to secure loyalty, she was often repaid with betrayal. Friends who accepted her gifts sometimes turned against her. Companions who benefited from her generosity gossiped about her weaknesses. Yet she did not stop giving. Even when she was hurt, even when her fortune dwindled, she remained open-handed. Was it foolishness, as some claimed, or was it simply an inability to close her heart, no matter how many times it was wounded? We must remember, dear listener, that Barbara had been deprived of affection from her earliest years. Perhaps, in giving, she hoped to create what she had lacked: bonds of loyalty, gestures of gratitude, echoes of love. Money, for her, became more than currency. It became language, a way of saying what words could not. Each gift was a message: see me, stay with me, care for me. And though many misunderstood, though many exploited her, the sincerity of her intent cannot be doubted. The world, however, rarely views generosity without suspicion when it comes from the wealthy. People assumed her giving was an attempt to buy affection, to control, to flaunt. And perhaps, in some cases, it was intertwined with such motives. But can we not also see the vulnerability beneath it? Can we not imagine a woman who longed for the security of loyalty and who used the means she had, her fortune, to invite it? The tragedy lies not in her giving, but in how often it was misunderstood, how rarely it was reciprocated with genuine affection. Her philanthropy was not only material, she gave of her time, her presence, her attention. In conversations, she listened intently, offering sympathy, offering kindness. She could be remarkably gentle, patient with those who had little to offer her in return. Those who truly knew her often remarked on this quality, that beneath the headlines, beneath the diamonds, Barbara was kind. It was, perhaps, her most defining trait, and yet it was the one least remembered by the world. The coins falling into an unseen hand remind us that generosity often disappears without echo. A gift given becomes part of another life, unseen, unrecorded, forgotten by all but the one who received it. And so it was with Barbara's giving. Her charities benefited, her friends were helped, her acquaintances relieved, yet history rarely records these acts. What endures instead are the scandals, the failed marriages, the wasted millions. But perhaps that is the nature of true generosity. It is not meant to be remembered, only to be given. As her fortune declined, Barbara still sought to give. Even when she had little compared to what she once possessed, she remained willing to share it. Her instinct was always toward open-handedness. This, more than anything else, separated her from the caricature painted by the world. She was not greedy, not clinging to her fortune. She was generous, often to her own detriment. And though it left her vulnerable, it also revealed her humanity, her unwillingness to harden her heart despite all she had endured. Is it not remarkable, dear listener, that a woman so wounded, so often betrayed, could still give? Many in her position would have grown bitter, closed themselves off, withheld what they had. Barbara did not. Her heart remained open. Her hand remained extended. And though it may have cost her dearly, it also redeemed her, for it showed that she was more than her sorrow, more than her decline. She was, in her way, a giver of life, a source of comfort to those around her, however briefly. And so this chapter of her story is marked not by jewels or gowns, not by scandals or betrayals, but by the simple sound of coins falling into an unseen hand. It is the sound of generosity, quiet, unnoticed, fading into silence once given. It is the sound of a heart that refused to close, even when the world gave her every reason to retreat. We leave her here, in this moment, surrounded not by applause nor by headlines, but by the quiet dignity of giving. The coins fall, the hand receives, the act is complete. No one writes about it, no one applauds it, but it is real. And in the end, perhaps such moments matter more than all the ballrooms, all the scandals, all the headlines. They are small, unseen, yet they reveal the truth of who Barbara Hutton was, not merely the poor little rich girl, but a woman who gave again and again, even when it left her with nothing. The coins fell into the unseen hand, their sound fading into silence, and then, far away, there came the slow tolling of church bells, their notes rolling through the air with solemn weight, as though announcing not a celebration, but a passing, not a beginning, but a change. For the world in which Barbara Hutton had first come to prominence was itself fading. The old aristocracies, the grand salons of Europe, the rituals of class and wealth that had once defined society, were giving way to new currents, new movements, new uncertainties. Barbara, fragile and luminous, stood as a relic of another age, a figure caught between the fading grandeur of the past and the shifting realities of the modern world. She had entered life in 1912, in an era when titles and fortunes still commanded reverence. Princes, dukes, and counts moved through the drawing rooms of high society, and for a time it seemed that their world was eternal. But by the mid-20th century, wars had shaken the foundations of empire, revolutions had redefined power, and the gilded traditions of old Europe were crumbling. The aristocrats she had married, the titles she had once cherished, became less symbols of permanence than relics of a world slipping into memory. The church bells tolled not only for individuals, but for entire ways of life. Barbara herself, though American by birth, had always felt drawn to the elegance of Europe. Her marriages bound her to its nobility. Her travels carried her through its capitals. Her jewels and gowns reflected its traditions. Yet as the decades passed, she must have sensed that the world around her was changing in ways she could not control. The fortunes of aristocrats diminished, the reverence of titles faded, and even the extravagance of the wealthy was viewed with suspicion in an age increasingly shaped by wars, by social movements, by new values. She, who had been the subject of fascination, now seemed more like a ghost of a vanished era. The Second World War had already revealed how fragile wealth and privilege could be. Estates were abandoned, castles destroyed, families displaced. Barbara, with her immense fortune, remained shielded in some ways, but even she was not untouched by the atmosphere of uncertainty. The men she married, the friends she kept, were themselves struggling to adapt to a world where titles carried less weight and fortunes were less secure. In this sense, Barbara's decline mirrored not only her personal struggles, but the broader decline of the world that had shaped her. It is said that she often seemed out of place in later years, as though her very presence carried the aura of a time that no longer existed. In the 1960s and 70s, when the world was preoccupied with new freedoms, new movements, new voices, Barbara remained a figure of old elegance, still devoted to silks, jewels, and rituals of refinement. Younger generations saw her not as a symbol of aspiration, but as a curiosity, a woman clinging to a vanished ideal. The church bells that tolled in the distance seemed to mourn the passing of her world, even as they marked the persistence of her presence within it. And yet, Barbara was not entirely apart from the changes. Her generosity, her philanthropy, her compassion aligned her in unexpected ways with the new currents of social consciousness. She gave to causes that sought to alleviate suffering, to institutions that worked toward health and education. In her own way, she bridged the old world and the new, embodying both the extravagance of the past and the yearning for humanity that the future demanded. Still, the contrast was sharp, and it left her adrift, belonging fully neither to the world she had inherited nor to the one that was emerging. The tolling of the bells reminds us that time does not pause for individuals, no matter how wealthy, no matter how adorned. Barbara, who had once seemed to embody permanence, was revealed as transient, as mortal, as subject to the same currents as all others. Her beauty faded, her health declined, her fortune dwindled, and around her the world itself shifted. The grandeur of old Europe dissolved, the rhythms of society changed, and Barbara stood as a figure both remembered and forgotten, admired and pitied, revered and mocked. Perhaps she herself felt this dissonance. Did she walk through cities she had once known, only to find them transformed, their old elegance replaced by modern harshness? Did she listen to the bells of churches that had once called to kings and queens, and wonder if anyone still heard them with reverence? Did she, in her solitude, feel herself not only a widow of love, but a widow of time itself, mourning not only her son, but the entire world that had formed her identity? There is a sadness in being left behind by history. It is not only the loss of personal fortune or health, but the loss of belonging, the realization that the structures and traditions that once gave meaning have vanished. Barbara's life, already marked by loneliness, was compounded by this broader solitude, the solitude of an age that no longer fit her. She was like a figure walking through ruins, clothed still in silk, carrying still her jewels, but surrounded by a world that had moved on, indifferent to the symbols she carried. And yet, in this displacement, there was also a strange beauty. Barbara became, in her later years, a living reminder of impermanence. She embodied the truth that wealth and titles, no matter how grand, cannot withstand the passage of time. The church bells tolled and their sound carried across centuries, reminding all who heard them that no world endures forever, that even empires fade, that even heiresses become fragile figures in empty rooms. And so this chapter closes with the sound of bells tolling in the distance, their notes heavy, solemn, unhurried. They mark not only the decline of Barbara Hutton, but the passing of an era, the fading of aristocracy, the erosion of traditions that once seemed eternal. She stands beneath their sound, frail yet dignified, her silk still brushing the floor, her jewels still catching the light, her presence still luminous even as her world dissolves around her. The bells continue to toll, and in their sound we hear both mourning and reminder, both farewell and truth. The bells tolled with solemn weight, echoing across a world that no longer resembled the one she had once known. And when their sound faded, what remained was the dim glow of a lamp casting long shadows against a wall. The light was soft, fragile, almost hesitant, illuminating a room far smaller than the palaces she had once inhabited. This was the setting of Barbara Hutton's final years, not in vast estates or grand salons, but in a modest suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills, where she lived quietly, surrounded not by courtiers or companions, but by memories. It is a striking image, is it not, dear listener? A woman who had inherited a fortune beyond measure, who had walked through ballrooms wearing diamonds like constellations, who had married princes and mingled with stars, now lived her days in a single room, her world reduced to walls that whispered of impermanence. Yet perhaps there was a strange poetry in this decline, a truth revealed in simplicity that all the splendor of her earlier years had obscured. For in the quiet of that hotel suite, with only the lamp to keep away the dark, Barbara was left at last with herself, stripped of illusions, stripped of adornments, faced only with memory and time. Her health by then was frail, her body thinned by years of dependency and sorrow. She walked slowly, her once luminous beauty reduced to a shadow of itself, though still there remained in her face a gentleness, a trace of the radiance that had once dazzled the world. Visitors, when they came, often remarked on her delicacy, as though she might dissolve if touched too firmly, as though the weight of a single word might be too much to bear. She lived not in the public gaze now, but in the half-light of private solitude, her fame lingering more in memory than in presence. The room itself carried the quiet of retreat. A lamp on the table, its light spilling across books she sometimes opened but rarely finished. Curtains drawn halfway against the brightness of California days, as though too much sunlight would be unbearable. A few photographs, carefully placed, reminders of her son, of moments now unreachable. Perhaps a vase of flowers, though wilting, their fragrance faint, their beauty fleeting. This was her world at the end, small, fragile, yet still marked by a touch of elegance, the instinct for beauty never entirely extinguished. Outside the hotel, life went on with its usual noise. Cars passing, footsteps echoing, voices laughing on the street below. But inside her suite, time slowed, measured not by events, but by the steady turning of hours into days. The world had once revolved around her, newspapers chronicling her every move, but now she revolved quietly within her own memories, her own thoughts. And perhaps there was, in this retreat, a kind of peace she had never known in the glittering chaos of her youth. But solitude is never simple. For Barbara, solitude was both refuge and torment. It shielded her from the cruelty of gossip, from the betrayals of false friends. But it also left her alone with the weight of her past. Memories became companions, but they were not always kind. The laughter of her son returned to her in dreams, only to dissolve upon waking. The echoes of her marriages, their beginnings filled with hope and their endings filled with sorrow, revisited her like ghosts, reminding her of promises broken and love never secured. The headlines that had followed her throughout her life still whispered in her memory, the cruel phrase, "poor little rich girl," lingering like a verdict that would not fade. And yet amid all this, there was still dignity. Barbara did not rage against her fate, nor did she cast blame upon the world. Instead, she seemed to accept her final years with quiet resignation, as though she had long understood that her story was not one of triumph, but of endurance. She endured her solitude, her frailty, her decline, with a gentleness that reflected not bitterness but weariness, a readiness to release herself into the silence that approached. There were still moments of kindness. She spoke gently to those who cared for her, offered warmth when she could, showed gratitude for small gestures. Even diminished, she remained generous of spirit. And in this, perhaps, we glimpse the essence of her life more clearly than in any ball or marriage. A woman wounded, fragile, misunderstood, yet still capable of tenderness, still capable of grace. The lamp glowed on, its light casting long shadows that stretched across the walls, shifting with the hours, marking the slow passage of time. In those shadows, we may see the outline of Barbara's life, a silhouette fragile yet enduring, luminous yet darkened by sorrow, elegant yet marked by decline. She had been the heiress, the bride, the mother, the widow, the recluse, and now she was simply a woman nearing her end, her story nearly complete. Is it not fitting, dear listener, that her final years were not filled with noise but with quiet? For so much of her life had been spectacle, imposed upon her by fortune and by fame. And yet beneath the glitter, she had always longed for simplicity, the warmth of love, the steadiness of companionship, the safety of belonging. In that small hotel room, stripped of grandeur, perhaps she came closer to that simplicity than ever before. Perhaps in the silence, in the glow of a single lamp, she found a measure of the peace that had eluded her amid diamonds and applause. The world outside no longer paid her much attention. New names filled the papers. New scandals entertained the public. Barbara Hutton became less a figure of fascination than a faint memory, a story recalled by those who had lived through her era. But within her, the story still lived, carried not in headlines, but in her own heart, with all its wounds and all its fragile hopes. And so we leave her in that room, the lamp glowing, the shadows stretching long across the walls. The church bells that tolled for the passing of her world have faded into memory, and now the quiet reigns. Barbara sits within it, frail, gentle, waiting, remembering. The silk gowns, the jewels, the palaces, the laughter, the betrayals, all have become shadows, flickering against the walls of her solitude. The lamp continues to glow, small but steady, illuminating a woman whose story, though tragic, remains luminous in its humanity. The lamp glowed softly, shadows stretching long across the walls, until another sound joined the silence, the faint scratching of a pen, hesitant, stopping, starting again, and then halting, unfinished. For as Barbara Hutton sat quietly in her solitude, others had already begun to write her story, to place her life into words that would endure beyond her presence. Biographers, journalists, gossip columnists, each took up their pens and set about shaping her existence into narrative, into myth. Yet the pen, though scratching busily across pages, could never quite capture her truth. It left lines unfinished, sentences uncertain, as if aware that the essence of Barbara could not be fully contained. The world loves to tell stories, and it especially loves stories of the rich and the sorrowful. Barbara's life, with its paradox of immense fortune and relentless tragedy, was irresistible. To some, she was a cautionary tale, proof that wealth cannot buy happiness. To others, she was a figure of romance and scandal, her marriages and jewels more compelling than her acts of kindness. Books were written, articles published, documentaries produced, each one scratching at the surface of her life, each one adding to the myth of the poor little rich girl. But myth, for all its power, often obscures the person beneath it. The scratching of the pen, unfinished, reminds us that these tellings were always partial. They captured the spectacle, yes, the ballrooms, the scandals, the jewels. They captured the sorrow, the lost child, the broken marriages, the decline. But did they capture the quiet moments? Did they capture the sound of her son's laughter echoing through her memory, the feel of silk between her fingers, the relief she found in a single act of giving? Did they capture the fragility of a woman sitting alone in the glow of a lamp, her heart still tender despite a lifetime of wounds? These details often escape the pen, left unfinished, unspoken, lost between the lines. It is a peculiar thing, is it not, to have one's life shaped not by oneself, but by others. Barbara, in her later years, no longer controlled her narrative. The world told her story for her, often with cruelty, sometimes with pity, rarely with true understanding. She became less a person than a symbol, less a woman than a myth. And myths, once written, are difficult to unravel. They endure in the public imagination, repeating themselves with each new retelling, erasing nuance, erasing humanity. Yet perhaps Barbara herself expected this. She had lived too long in the gaze of others not to know that her story would outlive her, told by voices that did not know her heart. Perhaps she resigned herself to it, just as she had resigned herself to solitude. But perhaps, too, she hoped that among the many tellings, some might glimpse the truth, some might look past the myth to the woman within. The unfinished scratch of the pen suggests that the task was never completed, never resolved, that the whole of Barbara Hutton remains beyond reach. The myth that formed around her was powerful, yet it was also incomplete. People remembered her as the heiress, the beauty, the scandal. Few remembered her as the giver, the mother, the fragile soul. Fewer still remembered her kindness, her gentleness, her quiet courage. And so we are left with fragments, with contradictions, with a story that can never be fully written, only approximated. The scratching of the pen remains unfinished because the truth remains unfinished. And here, dear listener, we may pause to reflect on the nature of legacy. Do we ever truly control the stories told about us? Or are we all, in the end, subject to the pens of others, to the memories and myths they choose to write? Barbara's life in its extremes illustrates this truth with particular clarity. She lived, she loved, she suffered, she gave. But what endures in the public imagination is only part of the story. The rest remains in the shadows, in the silence, in the unfinished lines. Perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps no life can be fully captured, no matter how many words are written. Perhaps the very attempt is doomed to incompletion, for human existence is too vast, too subtle, too mysterious to be confined to paper. Barbara Hutton, like all of us, was larger than the myths told about her, more complex than the phrases that defined her. And though the world scratched eagerly with its pens, it could never finish her story. In this, there is a kind of strange mercy. For while myths can confine, they can also preserve. Barbara's name remains known. Her story continues to be told. Her presence endures in memory. Even if the telling is incomplete, even if the pen leaves lines unfinished, she is not forgotten. She remains a figure who stirs reflection, who provokes questions, who reminds us of the paradoxes of wealth and sorrow. Her story continues not because it was neatly concluded, but because it was left open, unresolved, unfinished. And so we hear again the sound of the pen scratching, pausing, stopping, leaving its mark incomplete. It is the sound of others trying to tell her story, and of the impossibility of ever fully succeeding. It is the sound of history being written, and of mystery remaining. Barbara herself sits in her quiet room, the lamp casting shadows, the pen scratching in the distance. She does not hold the pen. Others do. And perhaps that is her final paradox, that the heiress, who had everything, could not control the one thing she longed for, to be understood. The pen rests at last, unfinished, its ink drying on half-written lines. The story is not complete, and perhaps it never will be. We leave her here, caught between myth and truth, between the stories told by others and the silence she carried within herself. The scratching fades, and in the stillness we are left with the awareness that some lives cannot be written to their end. They can only be glimpsed, their essence flickering like the glow of a lamp, their truth remaining always just beyond words. The scratching of the pen faltered and fell still, its final line left unfinished, and in that pause there rose a question, whispered into silence, unanswered, unresolved. Who was Barbara Hutton, truly? Was she the heiress who embodied the excess of wealth, or the child forever seeking the love she had lost? Was she the figure of scandal and extravagance described in newspapers, or the fragile woman who gave freely, who longed simply to belong? These questions lingered, suspended in the quiet, for her life was not one of certainty, but of contradiction. A story woven of opposites that never reconciled. She was rich beyond imagination, yet lived much of her life in poverty of spirit. She possessed jewels that shone like fragments of stars, yet her heart carried darkness that no light could dispel. She married princes, dukes, playboys, even a movie star, yet never found the companionship she so desperately desired. She gave generously, even recklessly, to others, yet received little loyalty in return. To some, she was a symbol of glamour. To others, a cautionary tale. But to herself, who was she to herself? Did she see her own contradictions clearly, or did she drift between them, carried by the tides of circumstance, never pausing long enough to define herself? It is tempting to resolve contradictions with easy answers, but Barbara's life resists such simplification. She was both saint and fool, both giver and squanderer, both radiant and broken. She inhabited extremes, and yet within those extremes lay the ordinary human longing that binds us all. What she sought was not extraordinary: love, loyalty, belonging. What made her story extraordinary was the vast fortune that both enabled and obstructed that search. Her wealth gave her freedom to move through the world, but it also ensnared her, attracting those who saw not the woman, but the treasure. She was both liberated and imprisoned by it, both sovereign and captive. Consider, dear listener, the image of her seated in a grand ballroom, diamonds at her throat, silk sweeping the floor, surrounded by admirers. To the world, she was the picture of fulfillment. Yet within, she felt empty, unseen, unheard. Now consider her later, in a quiet hotel room, stripped of grandeur, her fortune diminished, her body frail. To the world, she was the picture of ruin. Yet perhaps within those quieter moments, there was also a trace of peace, a release from the burdens of spectacle. Which image is true? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Contradiction lies at the heart of her story, refusing resolution. Barbara's life invites reflection not only on her own fate, but on the nature of human longing itself. Are we not all in some way contradictions? We seek permanence, yet live in impermanence. We crave love, yet often wound one another. We pursue beauty, yet are undone by sorrow. Barbara's contradictions were sharper, more visible, amplified by wealth and fame, but they were not foreign to us. They were simply more visible, magnified in the lens of public fascination. The whispered question into silence reminds us that some lives are not meant to provide answers, but to stir reflection. Perhaps Barbara's purpose, if one may use such a word, was not to resolve, but to remind us of the frailty that exists even in privilege, of the emptiness that can accompany abundance, of the longing that persists despite every apparent fulfillment. In this way, her life was less a story of one woman and more a mirror held to the human condition. And yet, we must not forget the uniqueness of her suffering. To live always doubted, always suspected, always reduced to fortune. That is a particular loneliness, one most of us will never know. Barbara's tragedy was not only personal but symbolic. She revealed the hollowness of society's fascination with wealth, its blindness to the soul beneath the glitter. In calling her the poor little rich girl, the world both pitied and mocked her, failing to see that in doing so, it revealed more about its own cruelty than about her. What did Barbara think in her final years, as she sat beneath the dim lamp, shadows stretching across the wall? Did she whisper her own questions into the silence? Did she wonder if her life had meaning, if her search had been in vain, if love was ever possible for her? Or did she find in the quiet a different truth, that contradictions need not be resolved, that it is enough simply to have lived, to have sought, to have endured? Her contradictions endure beyond her life, shaping her legacy. She is remembered both as glamorous and tragic, both admired and pitied, both envied and dismissed. Some see her as a symbol of waste, others as a victim of circumstance. Both views contain truth, yet neither contains the whole. The whole lies in the silence between, in the whispered question that remains unanswered. And so we pause here, in that silence, with the awareness that not every story can be neatly concluded, not every life can be explained. Barbara Hutton's life was filled with contradictions, and it is in those contradictions that her humanity is most visible. To deny them would be to deny her. To accept them is to honor the complexity of her existence. The whispered question fades, leaving only the stillness of the room. The lamp glows on, the shadows stretch, and Barbara remains, a figure both radiant and sorrowful, both poor and rich, both seen and unseen. Her story does not resolve but lingers, like a question unanswered, like a truth half-spoken, like a life both extraordinary and profoundly human. The whispered question lingered in the air, unanswered, and into that silence came the faintest of sounds, the crack of a mirror splintering. The glass, once smooth and whole, now reflected a fractured image, each shard showing a different angle of the same face. This, perhaps, is the truest emblem of Barbara Hutton's story. A mirror cracked, never entirely destroyed, reflecting not a single truth but many, each fragment revealing part of her and concealing the rest. For her life, more than most, invites interpretation, invites the weaving of fable, as though she herself were less a person than a symbol, less a woman than a parable for her time and for all times. What does the cracked mirror tell us? It tells us of beauty, dazzling yet fragile. Barbara was admired for her elegance, for the jewels that adorned her, for the silks that whispered as she walked. She shone in ballrooms. She was photographed, painted, described as radiant. Yet beneath that beauty lay sorrow, loneliness, dependence, a heart that never found its resting place. Beauty, then, was both her gift and her curse, a mask that dazzled the world even as it concealed her wounds. The mirror reflects both radiance and fracture, and both are true. The mirror also tells us of wealth, immense and inexhaustible in appearance, yet dwindling, squandered, lost. Barbara was the heiress of Woolworth, inheritor of millions, a woman who could buy palaces, yachts, jewels beyond counting. And yet, by the end of her life, much of it was gone, scattered through marriages, betrayals, and generosity. The world judged her harshly, calling her reckless, frivolous. But perhaps the cracked mirror suggests a different view, that wealth itself is fragile, no matter how vast, and that the illusion of permanence it offers is easily broken. In Barbara's story, we see wealth not as a fortress, but as glass, shining brightly, then cracking under the weight of time. And what of love? The mirror reflects many faces, princes, playboys, actors, barons, each stepping forward, each promising devotion, each retreating or betraying. Her marriages were numerous, her romances public, yet none gave her the lasting loyalty she desired. The cracked mirror shows us love not as a single reflection, but as fragments, moments of tenderness, sparks of hope, gestures of devotion, all undone by betrayal, by indifference, by the suspicion that fortune, not affection, drew her partners near. And yet, even within the cracks, one image remains whole, the love between Barbara and her son, Lance. In that reflection, the mirror did not shatter. That bond was pure, and its breaking came not from betrayal, but from fate. The cracked mirror, then, becomes a parable. It tells us that wealth, beauty, love, all the things society reveres, are fragile, subject to fracture, unable to protect us from sorrow. It tells us that behind every glittering surface lies vulnerability, that behind every image adored by the public lies a deeper, more complicated truth. Barbara's life becomes a fable not because it offers a clear moral, but because it reveals the ambiguity of existence, the way fortune and tragedy intertwine, the way desire and loneliness walk hand in hand. Is this not, in its way, the story of all human striving? We seek wealth, beauty, love, believing they will bring us peace. Yet often they bring us only new forms of longing, new forms of sorrow. Barbara's life, magnified by its extremes, reflects our own in its essence. She was no different in her desires, no different in her hopes. What set her apart was the scale upon which her contradictions played out, the stage upon which her story unfolded. She became a mirror, cracked and incomplete, in which society could see itself, and so her story is retold again and again as a modern fable. Writers describe her as a caution, reminding readers that money cannot buy happiness. Others describe her as tragic, a victim of circumstance, of family, of fortune. Still others see in her a strange nobility, a woman who endured suffering without hardening, who continued to hope even when hope betrayed her. Each telling is a shard of the cracked mirror, reflecting part of her truth, but never the whole. But perhaps this is fitting, for fables do not exist to provide complete portraits. They exist to provoke reflection. And Barbara's life provokes reflection more than most. What do we value? What do we envy? What do we fear? Her story makes us ask these questions, forces us to confront the contradictions within our own lives. The poor little rich girl becomes not merely a figure of pity, but a symbol of the paradoxes that shape us all. In the cracked mirror, we also see the cruelty of society, for it was society that named her, judged her, consumed her story as entertainment. The world watched her decline with fascination, not compassion. It whispered about her marriages, mocked her frailty, measured her fortune as though her humanity were secondary. The mirror reveals not only Barbara's fragility, but our own tendency to miss-say, to reduce, to turn people into symbols rather than honor them as souls. And yet, amid the cracks, there remains beauty. Barbara's generosity, her kindness, her devotion to her son, her appreciation of art and elegance, these are fragments that shine even within the broken glass. Her story is not simply one of failure or waste, it is also one of endurance, of persistence in longing, of refusal to give up on love despite betrayal. She may not have found what she sought, but she never ceased to seek it. And in that persistence, there is a kind of grace. So we return to the sound of the mirror cracking, faint but final, leaving behind shards scattered across the floor. Each shard reflects part of Barbara's life, part of her truth. To gather them is impossible. To see the whole is beyond us. But to look into them, one by one, is to glimpse the complexity of a woman who was more than the name given to her, more than the myth created around her. She was a mirror of her time, and in her fractures we see our own. And so we leave her here, with the mirror cracked, the fragments glinting faintly in the light of the lamp. The silence deepens, but within it lingers the sense of fable, the awareness that Barbara's life, though tragic, continues to speak. Not with clear answers, not with moral certainty, but with questions, with contradictions, with reflections that draw us into our own longing. The mirror cracks, but it does not vanish. It remains, fractured yet luminous. Like Barbara herself, the mirror cracked, its shards glinting faintly in the lamp's dim glow, and as their reflections faded, another light drew our gaze. The flame of a candle burning low, trembling in the still air. It flickered, bent, steadied, and flickered again, its wax running thin, its wick nearing its end. This, dear listener, is the image with which Barbara Hutton's story must conclude. A candle whose flame, though fragile, continues to give light until the final breath of smoke carries it into darkness. Neither saint nor sinner, neither solely victim nor entirely free, she was simply a fragile wanderer of time, her life luminous and sorrowful, extravagant and empty, tender and broken. Barbara Hutton died in 1979 at the age of 66, alone in the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, her body frail, her fortune nearly gone. The newspapers that had followed her from birth to death wrote once more of the poor little rich girl, repeating the phrase as if it contained her entire existence. They counted her marriages, they recalled her jewels, they listed her lost millions, and in doing so they seemed to close her life like a ledger, a record of gains and losses. But no ledger can capture the essence of a soul. No phrase, no number, no headline can measure the loneliness of a child abandoned, the laughter of a son cherished, the fragility of a woman who never ceased to hope. Her passing was quiet, without spectacle. The candle burned down, the flame wavered, the smoke rose, and the room fell into silence. Yet in that silence, her story endures, carried not by wealth or scandal, but by the questions her life leaves us with. What is happiness truly? Is it found in fortune, in beauty, in love? Or is it something quieter, something smaller, something she longed for but never held? Barbara's life was not a lesson neatly written, but it does stir reflection. It shows us that wealth cannot protect us from sorrow, that beauty cannot shield us from betrayal, that love, no matter how deeply longed for, is never guaranteed. It shows us also that generosity can endure even in fragility, that kindness can persist even when unreturned, that hope can survive even when disappointed again and again. She lived amid contradictions, and in those contradictions she revealed something deeply human. The candle's flame illuminates her as she was, a woman longing for tenderness, reaching for love, giving freely, enduring betrayal, mourning loss, and persisting in fragility. She was not only the poor little rich girl, though the world insists on remembering her that way. She was also the mother who cherished her son with a devotion beyond measure. She was the friend who gave too much, the traveler who sought solace in distant lands, the collector who saw permanence in jewels, the seeker who lit new candles even when the last had gone out. As the flame bends lower, we may imagine Barbara herself watching it, seeing in its flicker the echo of her own life. Bright at times, dazzling in brilliance, then faltering, uncertain, trembling against the draughts of sorrow. And yet, for all its fragility, the flame gave light until the end. So it was with her. Fragile, yes, broken, yes, but luminous still. Her story casting light upon the mysteries of wealth and longing, love and loneliness. Is it not true, dear listener, that each of us is a candle, burning for a time, casting shadows and light until we too are extinguished? Barbara's candle burned in a way few others have, surrounded by jewels and headlines, watched by the eyes of the world. Yet in its essence, her flame was no different from yours or mine, seeking warmth, seeking love, trembling in the draughts of time. Her story, though extreme, is not foreign. It is our story, magnified, mirrored, made myth. The candle flickers now, its final moments near. The wax pools, the wick shortens, the flame bends low. It does not rage, it does not flare. It simply diminishes, quietly, gently, until at last it vanishes, leaving only a thread of smoke curling into the air. The room is dark, but the memory of its light remains, imprinted upon the walls, upon the heart, upon the story we have told. And so Barbara Hutton passes into history, not as a lesson, not as a symbol, but as a fragile soul who lived, who longed, who suffered, who gave. Her story remains unfinished, like a pen left mid-sentence, like a mirror cracked, like a question whispered into silence. Perhaps that is as it should be, for no life, however rich or poor, can be fully written, fully known. We are all contradictions. We are all fragments. We are all candles flickering against the dark. Let us leave her here, in the quiet, the flame extinguished, the smoke fading, the room dark, but not empty. For in the darkness her story continues to glow, faint but enduring, carried in memory, carried in reflection, carried in the questions it stirs within us. Was she blessed or cursed? Was she foolish or faithful? Was she rich or poor? The answer, perhaps, is all of these, and none. She was simply Barbara Hutton. And now, dear listener, as you drift towards sleep, may the story of this fragile wanderer accompany you gently. Let her contradictions remind you of your own humanity. Let her longing echo softly within your own. Let her candle, though extinguished, leave a trace of light in your dreams. For her story is not only hers, it is ours as well. A reminder that wealth fades, beauty withers, love falters, but the search for meaning endures. The candle flickers one last time, then surrenders to the dark.